Hello and welcome. In this lecture video, I'll be talking about the differences between merchandising and manufacturing companies. I'll also talk about the different types of manufacturing costs, and I'll also talk about the differences between product costs and period costs. All right. So when we talk about merchandising companies versus manufacturing companies, merchandising companies purchased goods that are already completely done. They're finished goods from their own vendors, from their suppliers, for resale to their customers. So think the University of Mary Washington bookstore. The bookstore is purchasing finished goods from another supplier, and then they simply hold them in their stores for resale to customers. Manufacturing companies such as Ford or General Motors take raw materials, they purchase raw materials from suppliers, and then they make their cars, and then what they have is they have their completed cars that then they sell to dealers, and then the dealers sell it to their customers. So manufacturing companies have a production function where they turn raw materials into finished goods. Merchandising companies, on the other hand, purchase finished goods from suppliers and then just have them available for resale in the stores and then sell them to customers. Manufacturing companies, on the other hand, turn raw materials into finished goods through some production function of adding labor, materials, and overhead to make those products, make those finished goods, and then they sell them to customers. There are a couple types of costs that manufacturing firms have, and we need to make sure we understand these. And these are the costs that show up in the products that we make. These are the types of costs that show up in the products that we make, that the company makes. That's why they're called product costs. And there are three categories. It's direct labor, direct materials, MOH, which stands for manufacturing overhead. And then manufacturing overhead has three subclassifications. We have our indirect materials, indirect labor, and then on the next page where it continues, other manufacturing costs. So let's go through and define these. So we can say with direct labor, labor costs easily traceable to the products that we make. We being the company make. So assembly line labor. Now direct labor is a variable product direct cost. It is a variable product direct cost. So when I say direct, it means, remember we talked about in some of those other lecture videos, direct or indirect with respect to what? Now we're talking about direct with respect to the products that we make. We can easily trace direct labor, the assembly line labor, to the products that we make. Direct labor is also considered a variable cost. So that means that we're assuming these assembly line workers are being paid per hour. Okay? And then it's also a product cost, which means, as we'll talk about later in the lecture video, it shows up in cost of goods sold, and it also shows up in the value of our ending inventory. Direct materials are materials costs easily traceable to the products we make. So think about wood or steel, for example. So if we are a shipbuilder, the steel. If we make a table, the wood would be an example. Okay? And so similar to direct labor, direct materials is also a variable product direct cost. We also have manufacturing overhead. All other manufacturing costs besides direct materials and direct labor. Okay, or I'll say except direct materials DM, direct labor DL. Okay, so overhead is an indirect, okay, it's an indirect cost. So manufacturing overhead, what that means is that we can't easily trace manufacturing overhead to the products that we make, unlike direct materials and direct labor. We can't easily trace manufacturing overhead to the products that we make, unlike direct materials and direct labor. Okay? Overhead is also a product cost, which means it's going to show up in cost of goods sold. It will also show up in the value of our ending inventory. And it's considered mixed. It has some fixed and variable components. Overhead has 3 subclassifications. Let's talk about the first one, which is indirect materials. And I'll define that as insignificant raw materials not easily traced to the products that we make. So insignificant raw materials not easily traced to the products that we make. An example would be glue or screws would be examples of indirect materials. Okay, so it's indirect because we can't easily trace how many screws and how much glue we use to make a ship or to make a table. It can be difficult to easily trace all those indirect materials to those products. So we throw it into manufacturing overhead, and as we'll see in a future lecture video, we will allocate out that overhead to the products that we make. Okay? But it's not easily traceable to the products that we make, unlike direct materials. And there are also insignificant raw materials. That's why it's glue, screws, not the big piece of plywood that we might use to make a table. Think glue, think screws. Like I said, not the big piece of plywood or the 2x4s that we would use to make that table. Okay? Indirect labor costs not easily traced to the products we make. So an example would be the salary of production supervisor. So for example, the salary of the production supervisor, that production supervisor could be overseeing a lot of assembly line workers, and those assembly line workers could be working on a whole lot of different products. So it'd be very difficult to trace the salary of the production line supervisor to the products that we make. That's why it would be considered indirect labor. And then finally, our last category is kind of a catch-all. It's considered other. So we could say examples. We could say property taxes on factory. We could say insurance on the factory as well. And then finally, another example we could include would be utilities on the factory. Now, you can see the keyword here, factory, factory, factory. It has to be on the factory. It has to be on the plant or the production facility, not on corporate headquarters. If it's on corporate headquarters, as we'll talk about soon, that would be considered a period cost, not a product cost, okay? So let's look at some common manufacturing overhead costs. Indirect factory labor, as we talked about, indirect materials, any type of overtime, night shift, vacation and holiday time for factory workers. Look at the key word. Factory, 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 plant, plant, factory, factory, factory. These are all considered overhead, and they're considered product costs, not period costs, which we'll talk about in a second, but they're considered product costs because product costs are all those costs that are closely associated with making the final product. And I'll write that down. Product costs such as direct materials, direct labor, and manufacturing overhead, closely associated with making the final product. Okay? So product costs are closely associated with making the final product, and because they're closely associated with making the final product, they have to deal with the factory or the plant or the production facility as opposed to corporate headquarters. If this had said insurance on corporate headquarters, for example, that would not be overhead. It would not be a product cost. It would be a period cost, which is what we're going to talk about next. Okay? Period costs, the definition over here for period costs, as we'll see, are those costs not closely associated with making the final product. Okay? So as opposed to what we just saw on that prior page where we had insurance on the factory, because it said insurance on the factory, that means it's closely associated with making the final product because we make the product in the factory. But if it said insurance on corporate headquarters, that's not closely associated with making the final product because it's not on the factory. It's on the corporate headquarters. And so that means it's classified as a period cost. Okay? So we have two subclassifications of period costs. We can say our marketing and selling costs are all costs to secure customer orders and get the product to the customer. So an example would be commissions, or we could say depreciation on sales person's cars. Okay? Commissions or depreciation on salesperson's cars would be an example of marketing and selling. And then we can have our administrative costs, executive, organizational costs associated with general management of the organization. Okay, general management of the company. So an example would be the salary of the CEO or the salary of the CFO. Or we could even say rent on corporate headquarters would be another example of an administrative cost. Okay, so in the next lecture video, we'll continue our discussion of product and period costs. Thank you.